Hi, students. This video is just to tell you a little bit about the autobiography of Malcolm X, which is the book we're reading in English 101 Plus for the next few weeks. As you may remember, the theme of our class is our multicultural selves, and we've explored that theme through the debate over standard English and through an exploration of the different ways we code switch. And I thought this book would be a great one to read when we're thinking about this topic, not only because well, it's a great classic of American literature. It's one of the most important autobiographies ever written by an American. And I think it's something every educated American should read at some point. I also think it's a really entertaining, fascinating read. So I think you'll like it. I'm rereading it with you and remembering what a great read it is. So that's one reason I'm assigning it, but also because I think it's a really interesting portrayal of how one American navigates not being part of the dominant culture. So Malcolm X grew up at a time where segregation in the South was very entrenched, and where African Americans were had very few legal rights and were very much treated as second-class citizens. And he goes through a lot of different stages in his thinking about how to navigate that, and later becomes one of the greatest civil rights leaders in American history. He was fighting for rights for African Americans at the same time that Martin Luther King was, and he'll be talking about Dr. King later in the book, but he had a very different take on how African Americans should respond to the way they're treated in America. And we'll get to see how he develops that point of view. Yeah, that's why we're reading it as part of this class. And then as I was rereading the first 4 chapters today, I realized there were a few things that it might be helpful to tell you about, or, sort of clarify, or that might help you understand some of the things he's saying. The first thing is he mentions the other thing I wanted to mention is that you probably know the word autobiography usually means a book someone writes about their own life. So normally when you see an autobiography of someone like Ben Franklin, who also wrote a very famous autobiography, it just says, my autobiography by Ben Franklin. The autobiography of Malcolm X is a little unusual because Malcolm X did not actually write it. He was assassinated before it was published, but he had been talking with a journalist named Alex Haley, and he had basically met with Alex Haley a bunch of times and sort of told him his life story. And Alex Haley taped all those conversations. And then after Malcolm X was killed, he shaped them into an autobiography. So you often see, sometimes it just says the autobiography of Malcolm X by Alex Haley, which is a little confusing. This says as told to Alex Haley. There are some editions that say by Malcolm X and Alex Haley. So you see a lot of different versions. But Alex Haley certainly, shaped the story. But these are supposedly Malcolm X's words. Okay, so at the beginning of the book, Malcolm X is telling us about his parents, and he describes his father as as a follower of Marcus Garvey, who was somebody who fought for the rights of Black people. But Marcus Garvey had a very different um, uh, goal for African Americans than, say, Dr. Martin Luther King did. Marcus Garvey believed that Black people should stay independent of white people, that they should, there was, and I can go to the next terms on this list. I'm 55. I grew up in the 70s and 80s. And during that time, thinking in the United States about civil rights and about equal rights for African Americans were very shaped by the ideas of Martin Luther King, who was fighting for integration, right? He, during, the Jim Crow, when Jim Crow laws were, accepted in the South, Black kids and white kids had to go to different schools. They were segregated. And so segregation was seen as a real evil. And Dr. King and his followers were fighting for integration, for Black and white children to go to schools together, because only when they went to schools together would there be true equal education. And so many people who grew up at the time I grew up saw integration as essential to Black people having the same rights as white people. But Marcus Garvey thought, no, it's good that Blacks and whites are separate. Black people should set up their lives. They should have their own farms. They should have their own businesses. They should in no way integrate with white people, because if they do that, they will lose power. And later in Malcolm X's life, he too believed that Black people should have their own businesses, their own communities. They should not integrate. They should stay separate. I don't think he would call it segregation. He might call it separatist. But at a few points in these first 4 chapters, Malcolm X talks about integration loving Black people, and he sort of scoffs at it. And that's why he identifies it with Dr. King, and he doesn't believe that Black people will truly have equal rights if they're integrating with white people. He thinks if they're integrated with white people, they will sort of cede power to white people. So he scoffs at integration, which is a little surprising for those of us who grew up believing integration was sort of an accomplishment of the civil rights movement. So that's one thing I wanted to tell you about. The other thing is Malcolm X mentions Joe Louis, who was the first Black heavyweight champion who defeated a white fighter. And I just wanted to say that many African American writers who grew up during that time, such as Maya Angelou and Malcolm X, mentioned that as a real moment, a real early moment of Black pride in the United States. And that sense of Black pride is going to be something Malcolm X becomes very passionate about later in his life, as we'll see. So those were some things that I wanted to touch on before you started reading, or early while you're reading. I do want to mention the edition of this book that I have has a foreword and an introduction. You don't have to read those. You might want to, but you can skip them. For our reading for this week, you're just reading the first 4 chapters. It's about 72 pages. It starts with the chapter Nightmare. And I hope you enjoy it. And I look forward to discussing it with you next week.